Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear guests, this is extraordinary occasion that we have tonight, and I'm really honored to greet Thomas Piketty at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory here at our premises. We envisage this as, let's say, more deeply academic discussion. Yesterday it was for wider audience. Today we wanted actually to go a little bit more deeply into your thought, and especially to discuss a bit about the book Capital in Theology. I wouldn't actually now go and present the book and you, because we had extensive presentation yesterday with Zona, and I think most of the people were there, and all of people here know very well who are you. I would just give a brief introduction how we envisage this event. We have about 92 minutes to 2 hours, so we have to leave this room at 8 p.m. to be precise on time. And we wanted actually to have also the guests, so we have some people which are joining us online. Milan, just let me know. Okay. They're here. So they are here. I will now introduce the panelists and the order in which they are going to speak. We are going to have 3 rounds. In the first round, we are having our online guests. First is Branko Milanovic, who is our dear friend. And Branko, thank you very much for joining us and being with us again, who is visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and also senior scholar at the Stone Center for Socioeconomic Inequality. And basically, we all here know him as the leading name from the region which is dealing with inequality. Then we are going to have honor to hear Jayati Ghosh, who taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi for a long period, but then moved in past 3 years, and now she's professor of economics at University of Massachusetts Amherst. She worked and she is working in development economics, gender issues, significantly influencing also policy and academic discourse on these issues. Then we are going to have Nicolas Devaux. I hope I pronounced it well, I'm sorry. A prominent sociologist and researcher at University Paris 8 in France, who is specializing in social policies and their effects on marginalized population, offering critical insights into social inequalities and state interventions. We're going to close the first round with these 3 people, and then our idea is to give you the floor so you can respond to the comments which are going to have, and then we are going to continue with 2 smaller rounds with people we have here, actually, with our organizer on behalf of the Institute of this event, research fellow and coordinator of the research lab for post-Yugoslav studies and studies of socialism here at the Institute, Ivica Mladenovic. Then Jelena Žarković, whom you also met yesterday at the stage, who is teaching at Faculty of Economics Business here at the University of Belgrade in Serbia and working extensively on the issues of the poverty, inequality, and social welfare or welfare state. And that will be the second round. And in third round, we are going to have Marijan Ivković, research fellow and coordinator of Research Lab for Social Critique here at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. And finally, last but not least, as they say, Mikhail Randarenko, who is professor at Faculty of Economics and Business, same faculty as Jelena at University of Belgrade. And he's working also on public policy and its impact on economic inequality, providing insights into the role of governmental policies in shaping income distribution. So these are the people that we actually felt that would be the most invited to say and give meaningful comments about the book and to discuss about it. So without further ado, I would now give floor to Branko to join us. We envisage to have maximum 10 minutes per intervention. So if you can stick with this time, I would be really grateful to you. So thank you, Branko. The floor is yours. sound issue.
You're muted, Brandon.
Yeah, I'm muted. Yes, I just noticed it. Thank you very much. I will try even to be shorter than 10 minutes. I just finished watching El Clasico, so I can see now that, you know, with Toma in Belgrade and Julia, you do have another El Clasico tonight. So I would actually like to say only few words about capital and ideology, and also to connect it with the more recent book of Thomas and Julia on the French political conflict, which I think has sort of methodological, first is methodologically new, and secondly can be replicated elsewhere. So let me make basically 2 points. On the ideological part, I think things which could be potentially researched further are 2 ideologies that are not really discussed very much in the book. The first one is the Marxism and communism, which to some extent played the role of a religion. And that, of course, is a sort of ideological attitude of Marxists towards equality, has been studied quite extensively, but I think it's still worthwhile sort of studying it even more. And I might say, actually, in my recent book, Visions of Inequality, obviously, I do study Marx and maybe come to opinions which may not be agreed with by everybody. The second ideology is, it's particularly appropriate now that Thomas is in Belgrade, for other researchers to study actually the role of Orthodox Church and Orthodoxy as a branch of Christianity in its relationship to inequality. The question is actually, and I don't know that, but whether from the sort of doctrinary point of view, there are differences between Catholic approach or Protestant approach to equality compared to the Orthodox approach. Secondly, if there is such a difference, whether we might have some similarities in the approach to inequality, ideological approach to inequality, between very sort of diverse countries, starting from Ethiopia or the Copts in Egypt, all the way to Russia and Ukraine. The second point that I would like to make is about the second part of the capital and ideology, where Thomas has introduced a new way of actually using the data and looking, I mean, across a number of countries, at looking at the electoral records. Now, that work, I think, has been done in a slightly different methodological way, applied to his study of the French electoral records with Julia Caget over 200 years. And I think it's actually an extremely new approach, which does have many many applicabilities elsewhere. Now, it has not been done anywhere else, but I think it would be interesting to do it, and I'm sure it will be done for many other countries, including East European countries. And I thought actually, for example, in the case of Serbian researchers, we do have the data with obviously interruptions, but the data which start probably from 1860, which is not that bad. Actually, it's quite a few years. It's more than 150 years. You deduct maybe 50 years without elections, so you still come with almost a century of records. Now, these records are probably not as well preserved nor as clear as the French records, but still they would provide some information and an ability to discuss different political hypotheses. And obviously for other countries, and actually I mentioned that when we had a discussion in Paris about the new book by Thomas and Julia, I would say that this the idea of tripartitioning, which is actually argued in the book, could be very well applied to countries like Turkey and Hungary. So, and obviously the United States, but I was thinking now more of countries in Southeast Europe. So these are my 2 points. I actually, just to underline, it is not really so much a discussion of the book. It is more about the applicability and replicability of the work that was innovative work done by Thomas, and in this particular case also Thomas and Julia. So that was all that I would like to say.
Thank you very much, Branko, and thank you very much for being very precise and to the point. Now we are continuing with Professor Jayati Ghosh. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, at our time at least, but I guess that it's morning in your, so the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And let me just say what a privilege it is to be able to discuss Thomas' book and also in Branko's company. You know, I really do think this is Thomas' best book yet, and that's already a very high bar to cross. So it's a remarkable achievement. It's not just the long historical sweep that we are now accustomed to expect from Thomas, but I think there's a sense of the nuance and the complexities of different, and the interrelationships between social, political, and economic factors, which is really extremely illuminating and very insightful in many, many different ways. I was actually also very struck with your discussion of caste, Thomas. I think you managed to get the ideas of the complexity, the changing power dynamics, the ways in which colonialism and then domestic political economy have influenced caste politics and economics, and how that in turn has influenced the economic trajectory very well in a relatively short space. So, you know, congratulations for that and for your very succinct, but I believe precise discussion of the Chinese experience. So let me try and think of the additional dimensions that I would like to add to this, not just fascinating and insightful, but I would really argue one of the most important books that not just you have written, but has been written in the recent past about inequality and the historical processes. I do believe that you tangentially mention the gender aspect, and you certainly recognize, I think, the gender inequalities, but it could be incorporated to a much greater extent, specifically with respect to how this actually has impacted on accumulation strategies, how development trajectories have relied on particular and changing types of gender relationships. So it's not just about the outcomes and how, you know, the inequalities have been expressed in terms of class, but also social and ethnic and gender categories. It's also in terms of how those gender relationships have influenced the trajectory of capitalism itself, and how different types of capitalist experience have relied on rather different interpretations and patterns of gender discrimination, which I believe would be a very important and useful criterion, especially because of the importance of unpaid labor. I don't think it was mentioned in your book, I may have missed it, but I believe that the relative significance of unpaid labor is a very important thing for not just, you know, whether it's fair, unfair, unjust, unequal, and so on, but also in terms of how it plays out in capitalist dynamics. So I think that would be an important addition. The second has to do with the global aspect. And here too, you've been excellent, I believe, in the whole discussion of the colonial period. Some of those new empirical investigations, I think, are going to be very widely used and are already being widely used in terms of the kinds of debt owed, if you like, by the colonizing powers to the colonies, to the broader impact they have had in global inequality. You've been really excellent on the issue of colonialism. But I think more can be said about the current patterns of global inequality, which are not precisely colonial, but I would call them nonetheless imperialist. Now, I am using imperialist in a slightly different definition, but I believe a definition that Lenin originally did use it as, which is the struggle of large capital over economic territory, assisted by their states. And of course, economic territory can be all kinds of things. It of course, is markets, it's raw material, it's labor resources, it's increasingly new forms of economic territory, cyberspace, you know, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. So that struggle is very much alive and well and playing out with a very particular dynamic that has implications, not just for global inequality, but how that inequality plays out within developing countries. Now, I am more concerned with developing countries, I suppose, naturally, but I do believe that recognizing the role of domestic elites in our own countries, in India, in Brazil, in China, and so on, their relationship with global capital and the changing dynamics of that relationship has a terrific impact on how inequality plays out within our economies. And that would be a very useful dimension. In fact, if I may make a suggestion for your next book project, maybe you should really be now bringing that, that remarkable ability you have to look at long historical trends and very carefully at a lot of empirical data to this analysis of these global patterns, specifically in terms of how the elites have been, it's simplistic to call them one global elite, but how elites have been able to merge with particular interests of metropolitan elites and impose particular policies and trajectories within their own countries. I think that has implications for your policy proposals. And once again, I want to commend you for the ambition of your proposals, for not being constrained by current political realities, by not saying, oh, this can't be done, and by thinking big and thinking large, because we need those large visions and that greater, not necessarily utopian, but that greater demand for really transformational change, without which we're not going to get any movement in the progressive direction. But I think you have outlined that beautifully with respect to individual economies and particularly for northern economies. But let's also bring that to the global scenario, because we knew that the global architecture necessarily impedes a real discussion of inequalities globally, but also in terms of the ability of states to do things that would impact on inequality within their countries through taxation in the ways that you suggest, through the excellent idea of the inheritance tax and the subsequent dividend and all of those things. So let's think first of all of the global architecture that constrains fiscal space. Some of it results from tax treaties, some of it results from other bilateral treaties, some of it results from plurilateral and multilateral treaties like those in the WTO, which dramatically impede fiscal space. The inability to control cross-border financial flows affects governments across the world. Even the ones that would like to do something progressive are constantly looking over their shoulder to wonder how financial markets will react. And that impedes many of the transformational policies that you are proposing, independent of whatever happens in the domestic political economy. And of course, then we have the implications of a whole range of macro policies in the North that impact developing countries or less rich countries in massive ways, and already creating debt crises, adding to the climate crisis, dramatically increasing hunger and poverty because of big increases in commodity prices and so on, as well as the renewed struggle for new resources, all of which, of course, have an international dimension, but they play out in domestic inequality as well. So I think that would add a very important and necessary dimension to your discussion of inequality, where you're clearly now one of the leading global thinkers. And in addition, in terms of the domestic policy, I would add, if you recognize the unpaid labor part, then, it changes the type of policy prescriptions. Instead of a taxation that generates, let's say, pure dividend to individuals, we think of ensuring the sufficient care for all in a socially structured way, and in a way that promises dignity, remuneration, respect to those who are providing the care. We consider the control and access of wealth, of course, by gender, which you have already done in your World Inequality reports, but in other ways that recognize the very particular gender relationships in different societies and economies, and the access to natural resources in that context. Finally, I think, in your new book, in your project, which I hope will be international in scope, I hope you also recognize the massively differential impact of climate change, which already Lucas and others, your colleagues, have already done a lot of work on, but which is, there's an interplay of all of these relationships in terms of how the inequality unfolds. And I think the way in which you have laid out this wonderful historical sweep with such tremendous analysis and as I said, nuance and sensitivity, I think that allows us to hope that when you're adding these other dimensions, that will give us really a huge and wonderful comprehensive picture of how this plays out and how we can change it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting to hear your perspective, as well as Professor Milanovic trying to connect us with the developing world and the Southeast Europe in this case. And for this round, we have Nicolas Duo. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. Thanks for the invitation to share remarks. And first of all, I agree with Jayati. I think that Capital and Ideology is one of the most achieved writings of Thomas. For a very simple reason, he has shown, in my view, in his book, his ability to respond and to address remarks and critiques that have been made on Capital in the 20th century. And I'd like to start with that, with the fact that there were two series of critiques that have been made to his previous books and that have been addressed very consistently in Capital and Ideology. The first one is that the prior book was focused on the cases of France, Great Britain, and the United States, whereas Capital and Ideology is really embarking on a global perspective and is going beyond the Western world. And I think this is something that is key to illuminate the trends that have been at the core of the first book. And the second series of remarks that Thomas addressed in Capital and Ideology, and for me they are more fundamental, is the fact that he has managed to go beyond a purely economic vision of inequality and tried and achieved to capture a more multi-dimensional vision of inequality and capturing the more political, the educational dimension of inequality, which is really clear at the end of the book, where the political trends of the left in Western Europe are concerned. So I'd like to make 2 points, and 2 series of remarks will be very, very short. The first one is on the issue of ideology that has been raised forward by Branko Milanovic a few minutes earlier. And the second one is on the analysis of wealth. It's a minor theme in Capital and Ideology, but it seems to me to have very serious theoretical implications. So the first one is about the conception of ideology that is present in the book. In Marxist analysis, ideology contains a form of reversal of actual power relationships, a reversal that is expressed in superstructures that can be studied from the standpoint of literature, from law, from the political sphere itself. And here in the book, we find a definition of ideology that is structured around the ideas of internal coherence on the one hand and popular agreement on the other end. And we could say that as long as a regime is durable, as long as the regime holds, the political regime holds, inequality is considered or seems to be acceptable. And so my first question to Thomas will be, how do you capture the agreement of the populations? How do you have a sense of the reception by populations in many contexts that you cover in the book? And it seems to me that the issue of reception and the popular reception of ideologies, of cultural, political frames is key to many studies in anthropology, in cultural sociology, in many fields that have at the core of their scientific interest the relationship between institutions and populations. So the first question is really how the apart political attitudes at the very end of the 20th century in Western countries, how can the agreement of the populations, how can this reception can be captured, and what is the sense of the fact that beyond the measure of the analysis, beyond the measure of this agreement, this popular agreement, can the benefits of wider segments of the populations to certain ideologies or political regimes can be assessed or demonstrated. And the second dimension question is on a theme that is relatively minor in the book, but which is to me a key thesis: the idea that property or private wealth is not only an issue of distribution, as it was the case in Capital in the 20th century, but in Capital in ideology, there is this idea which is eliminating that wealth and property are an issue of time. When you control wealth, you control your own time and you control the time of others. And you have this really strong picture that is very fit with, of course, the social effects in terms of power, of social power that is at the core of the liberal democratic countries from the 19th century to today. And so my question here would be, to what extent this analysis, this really interesting, relevant analysis of wealth can be generalized to other non-democratic, non-Western countries. And here it's really the adaptation of the conceptual apparatus to the enlargement of the boundaries of the study that is in my scope. And lastly, I'd like to add a question about the not so much the political ambition of the book, not so much about the political strategy, but about several actors that are among the few that are able to develop an agenda at the global level. I mean the philanthropic foundations that are active in the field of global health, in the fight against poverty at the global level. We all know the role of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but it's only one among many private players. And it seems to me that at the end of Capital in the 20th century, private foundations could be considered in a way, not without critics, of course, but in a way as a kind of solution to the weight of private capital, because it was a kind of public control of the capital that was put forward as a part of the solution to global issues of wealth concentration. Whereas it seems to me, and I would agree with that, but I would like to know whether you agree with this, that at the end of Capital and ideology, you see private foundations, more as part of the problem than the solution, more as a symptom of a radical era of meritocracy than a part of the solutions to the global wealth concentration. So would these players, aside a global taxation system, a global strengthening of public institutions, would you see a role for them in the reforms you're pushing forward? Okay, that will be the political question. And thanks a lot for setting this discussion up.
Thank you very much to all of three of you. It was really interesting, and it seems that like many in this room, the implications of your theory on the non-Western liberal democracy is something which is really interesting question. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether if I want to see them, maybe I should sit there. Yeah, sorry. Yes, that's what I should have done from the beginning. Okay. Hello. So yeah, thanks a lot to all of you. Thanks a lot for all the organizers. You know, it's really incredible to be in Belgrade today and to be able to talk with Branko, Jayati, and Nicola, and all the others that are going to follow. So, you know, we've been very fortunate with Julia since yesterday to have such great hosts here in Belgrade, and you know, thanks a lot to everybody. It's been fascinating. So, you know, I have to be short because 4 other people are going to talk. So let me take a couple of points raised by each of you, but you know, there's no way I can answer everything. Branko, you're perfectly right that, you know, there are many ideologies, you know, including Orthodox ideology, Marxist, Communist ideology, which I don't necessarily investigate as much as they should. I mean, there's of course no way that a single book can do what this you know, the study of inequality regime and the transformation of ideology used to legitimate inequality and the way they rise and fall. You know, it's a matter for much more than a book, even if this one is pretty big. So you know, I fully agree with you know, all these limitations. Maybe let me say a few words, since you mentioned the book with Julia that we just published in French, or maybe for some of you who may not be aware of this, because it was only published in French so far. So this is a book called History of Political Conflict, Elections and Social Inequalities in France, 1789-2022. So this is a book that's focuses on France, so that's an obvious limitation. But at the same time, the advantage is that we can analyze in a sort of much deeper and detailed way the formation of political attitudes, the formation of political coalitions, the construction, deconstruction of various political blocs. And I think it goes much beyond you know, the part of capital and ideology on Brahmin left and merchant right and voting attitudes, which I now look at with a little bit of distance. You know, which that's a privilege of you know, doing more research, writing more books. Is that you know, I think I'm like all of us. I'm making progress, slow progress over time, and I think what we do with Julia in this book is a much deeper analysis on how you can form a bloc, a class alliance, in effect, within a sort of multi-dimensional class structure involving both territorial dimension and wealth, property, occupational dimensions. And the territorial dimension, which is almost absent from my previous book, at least, you know, in particular the sort of center, periphery, and metropolis versus countryside, different urban size of urban unit. You know, this entire dimension is not very present in my previous work, and I think in this new book, it's really much more at the center stage, and I think it allows us, at least it allows me, to better understand you know, how you can possibly form a coalition, you know, which can foster more historical change going in the direction of equality. And in particular, you know, I'm not going to make a presentation of this book now, but in particular, we stress that the political gap between the urban working class and the sort of rural working class is really a key dimension of whether you can make a successful political coalition. And the historical periods where the social conflict, the sort of vertical conflict about wealth, is able to dominate the territorial conflict and the urban-rural dimension, are really the period where massive historical change and redistribution can happen. And on the contrary, when you have a big gap, it's very difficult, and it makes it easier for the elite basically to win the day based on the division between rural and urban working class. And today, typically, we are in a situation in a country like France, but as Branko says, I think this applies to many more countries where the division between rural and urban has become much bigger. In France, it has never been as high since the 19th century, with a very different class structure, because, of course, it's no more the opposition between peasant and industrial workers. If anything, there's more manufacturing employment now in the smaller urban units in Western countries, and in particular in France. and low-wage employment in the metropolis has more to do with the services, partly in relation with the construction of the social state, lots of jobs in hospitals, cleaning profession, restaurants and shops. And so it's a different kind of proletariat. It's a different kind of multidimensional class structure, which I must say, until this book, I did not realize how much it has become correlated with the territorial dimension, and how much, in effect, industrial employment, which historically used to be associated to metropolis and to the suburbs of large metropolis, has moved away, smaller urban units. So that's about France, but I think looking at this issue in a much broader manner, looking at more countries, can be important to better understand the construction, deconstruction, and possible reconstruction of winning political coalitions for the future. So thanks, Branko, for raising this, and I hope we'll have other opportunities in the future to talk about this. Let me move to Jayati's comment. I think you're perfectly right, Jayati, that among the many limitations and weakness of the book, the book is stronger on maybe the colonial periods and the recent imperialist dimensions, and all the conflict about new forms of territorial extraction with the state support by China or by Western states, and that's, yes, that's clearly there's very little in the book about this, and that's hugely important. I think it's partly related to what I was just referring to about, the kind of class alliance between elite, local, southern elite, northern elite, and also class alliance between different segments of the working class and poor groups. So I think it's, it will fit very well into the research agenda. So thanks for the suggestion for the next book. I don't know if I will be able to do that, but, it helps me think more, globally about these issues. I must say, in my own books, I have written my very first, sort of important book was really centered on France and the history of inequality of France. Then I have written two more global books, Capital in the 21st Century and Capital and Ideology. And I've just written another book on France, and I think I will have to turn more global again in the next book. But these are difficult questions, because at some level, it's much more exciting to write a global book. But on the other hand, you cannot be, knowledgeable about everywhere. And so when you write a global book, you become more superficial, and you become. So it's also nice to have a field of work which you can really labourer and really know well what you're talking about. And from this viewpoint, I was very glad by what you said about the chapters on India, which I'm very glad to see that you enjoy the chapter on India in Capital and Ideology, because I must say, to me, this is my favorite chapter, and this is the one to which probably I have put the most work. I remember my first trip to India in 1996, visiting Abhijit Banerjee in Bengal, in Calcutta, visiting his parents, traveling a little bit through Bengal with him, and traveling through India. And I had such difficulties, understanding really what I was seeing, and this complex legacy of ancient status-based inequality with colonial rigidifications through British colonial censuses of the caste structure, and how independent India has been trying to deal with this legacy in a very impressive manner in many ways, but imperfect manner also. And I feel now I understand a little bit more. And I wish I could have read this chapter, first time I went to India. And so I think. So, I'm very glad that you liked it, because to me, that's really a very important part of the book, which I must say, I had a lot of troubles getting people in the West, interested, when I was talking to journalists in France or in Britain or in US about Capital and Ideology, and I was trying to tell them about the chapters on India, and, nobody seemed to care, which I was very sad with. So thanks for raising this. And last comment by Nicolas du vous. Yes, you know, I think you're right about this idea that you know, of property and wealth as control over time, control of others. Does it extend? You know, does it apply beyond Western? I think so. You know, I don't. I to a large extent, I think it does, because I think property regimes. You know, have more commonalities. You know, of course, communist and post-communist countries are different, but for countries that are you know, beyond this group, you know, I think the commonalities are actually quite important. But you know, we should definitely talk more about this. You had two specific questions which I want to answer very quickly. How do you investigate, how do you capture, you know, agreement and reception of ideology by the you know, different social groups at large? You know, that's obviously very complicated, and the answer depends on the society we look at. And for ancient societies, you know, it's clear that we have you know, the knowledge we have of the you know, acceptability and reception of this ideology is very difficult. So we all, you know, we're trying to use various sources, you know, sometimes from the literature, sometimes from administrative reports, sometimes from, you know, in the case of India, just to you know, what the reports by the colonial British administrators, you know, at the time of the first censuses that were conducted in the 1870s and 1880s in India. These are interesting testimony of how, you know, of their own perceptions of the class conflict or the caste conflict that they see around them. And of course, the people they listen to are mostly the elite group in India, the elite caste. And so they report mostly the way they look down at lower caste group. But still, I think there's a lot of interesting information. But you know, that will be you know, the viewpoint of the elite groups will be typically recorded more often than the viewpoint of lower dominated groups. So that's so we have to guess, and it's not so, you know, I'm trying to be careful about that and prudent, but you know, it's a lot of you know, we have to be imaginative sometimes. Let me conclude about your last question, which was specifically about philanthropic foundation, and you sort of suggested that maybe I was more positive about them in Capital in the 21st century than Capital and Ideology. So if I gave this impression, you know, it must be that I formulated things in the wrong manner, because no, I think I already in Capital in the 21st century, I am very skeptical about philanthropic foundation if they don't, you know, unless of course the rules of the game are clearly defined by the democratic deliberation and democratic assemblies. But for instance, you know, in Capital in the 21st century, I show how US universities endowments are rising, like, you know, there's a complete divergence. So, you know, if you look at the capital endowment of Harvard, Yale, Stanford, you know, the top three, you know, they between. So I use in Capital in the 21st century, I put together some data from this capital endowments from 1980 to 2010, I think, and you know, the top capital endowments of US universities are going up at a rate of 7-8% per year. Net of inflation, net of all administrative costs, net of everything, whereas, you know, bottom endowments go up at 2 or 3% per year, and those who don't have endowment, you know, of course, have 0%. And this has nothing to do with the generosity of former students. You know, of course, they try to pretend that it has something to do with their generosity, which in any case would have been obtained by extracting income from other people, their employees, or in the US or other parts of the world. But in practice, this generosity does not exist. So the gift made by former students represent, you know, less than 0.5% per year of the endowment. So when the top endowments of Harvard, Yale, Princeton rise at 7-8% per year. It's entirely driven by financial markets. So it's not, it has nothing to do with philanthropy. In fact, it's just that once you have a sufficiently large endowment, you are able to access to financial products on global financial markets, like obviously you don't buy U.S. Treasury bonds. U.S. Treasury bonds, you leave that to the people who have no better investment. But in the case of these top endowments, they put their money into complex financial derivatives, private equity, whatever, with huge size effect, scale effect in management. So basically, they pay what they pay to their wealth manager is less than 0.5% of their endowments. But when you have an initial endowment of $20 billion, 0.5% is going to be 100 million per year. So if you can pay 100 million per year, and if the people you pay for that are able to find you a return of 8% rather than 5%, that's good for you. Now, if you are poorer to begin with, you're not going to be able to do that. So at the end of the day, what this implies is that the philanthropic model, once you have foundations that get sufficiently big, you enter a sort of inegalitarian spiral where the top foundation, the top capital endowments are going to rise like crazy, and bottom universities in the US, not to mention universities in India, in Africa, in the rest of the world, have no money to spend, and these universities at the top or museum at the top, they don't know how to spend the money given how much money they have. This is this is a completely crazy model. So basically, you need to have some very progressive redistributive tax on these capital endowments for foundation, as progressive as for private individuals. I see no other solution. And then you can have small foundation, small philanthropic actors, of course, are fine. I mean, then we can discuss about the governance of these actors and, what are the different stakeholders that should be represented in their governing bodies. But in any case, you don't want these actors to become hegemonic actors as they are doing. I probably have been too long already. But thanks a lot, Jayati, Branko, Nicolas, for this discussion. That was very interesting for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much from our side also for joining us. I hope that you're going to stay with us also for the next two rounds. Now I'm giving floor to Ivica and then Jelena for the second round of questions.
I would like first of all, I would like to express my gratitude once again to Julia Cagé and Thomas Piketty for accepting our invitation to come to Belgrade. In doing so, with the symbolic capital they possess, they have assisted us in raising the level of public debate on socially and politically crucial issues for contemporary capitalism. My initial encounter with Thomas Piketty work occurred around the end of 2014 when I read interviews he conducted in connection with the increasing attention capital in the 21st century started gaining. This book, particularly through its English translation, emerged as a bestseller, provoking responses from intellectual minds whom I hold in high regard. My colleague and friend here present, Filip Balunovic, and I received an invitation from a Serbian weekly magazine Vreme to write a review of that book. This motivated me to finally read half of that very extensive book. Up until 2019, I regularly followed Piketty's interventions, such as his opinion column in Le Monde. That year, after the publication of the book Capital and Ideology, I was thrilled that someone of such global intellectual stature was openly contemplating the perspectives of an alternative social order. Specifically, he was thinking strategically about elements of such a social order, not leaning on old dogmas, but starting from existing power relations and the state of the economy. He proposed a form of socialism for the first 21st century. In the summer of 2020, while the pandemic was at its peak, and I submitted my doctoral thesis for committee review, finally securing a peaceful retreat in a rural house in Normandy owned by a friend. I began reading a book, Capital and Ideology. It took me about a month for endeavor. Of course, it wasn't for solo activity in Normandy, and I truly enjoyed it. A few days ago, I checked and found around 70 pages of notes I had taken while reading the book. In it, Piketty demonstrates how to write scientifically accessible work for a broader audience based on extensive empirical evidence, statistical analysis, theoretical constructions, etc. This was not the case with Capital and 21st century, a far less accessible for non-economist public. Despite Branko Milanovic presenting the Serbian edition of that book as readable like a historical novel, I, as someone pursuing doctoral studies in sociology and political science at that time, had a significant challenge following the author's argumentation, despite my enthusiasm. In my view, Capital and Ideology is much more a book in the field of history than economics, or more precisely, a book in the field of social science in general, truly one of the rare books deserving such a qualification. In it, the author combines an interdisciplinary approach, drawing on his erudite knowledge from various disciplines in the social science to offer a theoretical interpretative framework for understanding the ideological of justification of inequality in different historical, social, and national contexts. The main impression I get from Thomas Piketty's thread of publication is that each new book complements the previous one, further focusing on elements not fully elaborated in the previous. Considering constructive criticism directed at his previous books, from Capital in 21st century to Capital and the Ideology, a short history of equality, and the latest one co-written with Julia Cagé, Une histoire du conflit politique, or a history of political conflict, there is a clear and open continuity of expanding and deepening the topics from previous books. Even if he were to stop writing tomorrow, Thomas Piketty will have left behind a well-rounded theoretical interpretative system that few authors in the history of political thought can boast. I sincerely hope that his next book will be dedicated to the question of political strategy in the context of contemporary capitalism, something that I would say Eric Olin Wright has extensively addressed, mainly in the American context, but in a way that doesn't communicate sufficiently on a concrete level with real political forces and struggles in Europe. It seems to me that this question logically arises as the next topic for deeper strategic consideration from Piketty's latest book, and it is a topic that has been frequently raised in public debates involving both Thomas and Julia in recent weeks. Since we have very limited time for interventions, I will focus on two questions. The first question is directly related to the book Capital and Ideology, while the second is a bit more general and goes beyond that book. The first question concerns the welfare state, or more broadly, the relationship between the economic field and other social fields. Ideologically and theoretically, your explanation resonates closely to me. So the welfare state, as well as policies for greater equality in the West, were possible because dominated classes, especially in the period from 1932 to 1980, managed to achieve a better position in the balance of power. This was partly due to the fear of the dominant classes regarding the spillover of the Bolshevik Revolution from the East. Those transitions mostly occurred after the First and Second World Wars and the 1929 crisis, etc. You also link the crisis and failure of social democracy and the welfare state to the dramatic failure of the Soviet experiment, as well as the lack of creativity of elites to devise alternative models. You convincingly explain the success and failure of different social regimes, in this case, welfare state, through non-economic factors that primarily concern the relations of class forces within economic, civil, and political society, to use Gramsci's vocabulary. However, what I missed as an explanation, maybe I simply overlooked it, is the economic explanation for stagflation and simply the crisis of the Keynesian economic model that began to face functional problems purely on an economic level in the first half of the 1970s, a time when the Western political left, the labor movement, and even the USSR were at their peak. So my question is, what is the economic explanation for the crisis of the Keynesian model during that period? As for the second question, I will be shorter. I'm interested in your opinion on the relationship between ideas and matter, or how you position yourself in that eternal debate among philosophers, idealism versus materialism. In this context, what, in your view, is the role, significance, and meaning in class and political struggles of scientists and intellectuals who use the knowledge and capital acquired in the scientific field to state their position on political issues?
Now we're going to have Yelena, and she can highlight, and then.
Okay, so you can hear me. Thanks. I already asked you questions yesterday, so it seems that now I'm at the top 1% in terms of the distribution in Serbia, in terms of the distribution of questions asked to you, but okay, I'm happy because of that. So Ivica now mentioned, and I have a similar question. Well, you talk in Capital and Ideology about these rivalries between different ideological powers, right? And how important was this pressure coming from the Soviet Union and international communist movement in creating welfare state in Europe, right? It was a kind of answer. What would you say? Is there any ideological alternative to neoliberalism today? I mean, I read several articles arguing that we entered this post-neoliberal phase, but I mean, they mostly appear during the pandemic or at the end of the pandemic, but I'm not quite sure that's the case. So is there any alternative to this, like that can be presented as a opposing ideology? And my second question might be related to the first one, depends what you answer. It's related to the role of China. We in the West would say that there is no clear ideology that China is offering to, let's say, Global South, which it is mostly interested in. But well, if you read, I recently discovered the website with the talks of Xi Jinping, Chinese president. So if you read that, everything that is on the website, well, they're very clear what is their ideology. They call it socialism. I mean, you call it also in your book, although I know you're against that type of socialism. But if we look at the several facts that you also discuss in your book, the first one is that China is giving like huge sums of money to the Global West, mostly through its initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, right? I mean, last week it was 10 years anniversary of that initiative. Serbia, that is also a very important project and it's involved in it. And China is really, I mean, if you read about the things that like presidents of these poor countries say, what's China giving to them? These are really like public goods. It's not only like, you know, roads, ports, infrastructure. It's like they say, okay, China is building schools, hospitals, like in some remote African villages, for the first time they have electricity, like very, very basic things. So if we know that, and the fact that you also show in your book that China itself was, well, it was the, let's say, a victim of slavery and colonialism, it's proud to say that China's own development was not based on these colonial practices, right? So if we know that, and sorry, the third thing that you mentioned in your book, and that's the fact that in terms of this reparation of past injustices to these previous colonial societies, so that the West has not done much, right? So if we know this, if we know these three facts, so how do you think that these countries, I'm talking now about the Global South, so Africa, mostly Africa, because it really received huge sums of money from China during the last 2 decades. Unlike, you know, while the support coming from US and Europe was really, I mean, even declining during the last 2 decades. So how can these countries resist embracing this China-style authoritarian socialism, because that's how you call it in your book, knowing all these things, right? Yes, I wanted to say something. So, okay, I have one more question. So, but do I have time?
Well, you have time, just I don't know if he's going to have time to answer.
Because I really, I mean... Okay. Okay. So this is something from the new report about on global tax evasion. It was presented by Gabriel Zachman. So he's your former student, now a colleague, co-author, and he presented it on Monday. And I think there are several very, very interesting findings. So the first one is, well, quite optimistic. He says that that this offshore tax evasion by individuals has declined since 2016. And that's mostly due to this automatic exchange of information, bank information. That's something that you argued for in the Capital in the 21st century. But the bad thing, there are 2 bad things. So this idea that I mentioned last night, right, about the introduction of this global minimum tax for corporations, he says that there is a proliferation of loopholes and this thing is just it's not going too well according to the plan. That's the first thing. And the second thing, I'm more interested in that. He says that there are new forms of aggressive tax competition. And now let's focus on European countries. And if you look at the first, in terms of this shifting of profit into tax havens, so we know that from previous findings, but it's again confirmed in this later report that Netherlands, right, is the country #1 in terms of the profit shifted to this particular country. But Netherlands, it's also the first one on the list in terms of this applying this aggressive tax competition. And you say in your book, why is that bad, right? It reduces the progressivity of the European tax system. And I'm just wondering, because you're quite active, you mentioned this platform that you were, that manifesto that you were part of, but do you somewhere suggest that, you know, because like European Commission is punishing Poland and Hungary, they say because of the breaches of the rule of law. And they even announced some measures towards Spain because it's behind the schedule with judicial reforms. But do you? I mean, I think that if you really do something that is not considered like a rule of law, like in Poland and Hungary, well, you're mostly doing harm to yourself, right? Okay, that's also a bad image for EU, but mostly you're doing harm to your own country. But when you do the things that Netherlands is doing, you're doing harm to other countries. And there are no sanctions towards Netherlands. I mean, although it's impacting the welfare of European citizens, right? So I'm just guessing whether you had any similar ideas, you know, to suggest at these forums. I'm not aware what kind of sanctions could be applied towards Netherlands, but well, you know, like what's happening with UK now that after the Brexit, I mean, well, you have lots of ideas, right?
Thanks a lot. Thank you for very interesting questions, and the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me start with go back to what Ivica was saying. Well, first, you know, thanks a lot for all the nice things you said about my work. And, you know, sorry that Capital in the 21st Century was a bit difficult to read. You know, maybe you were not in the same mood at the end of your PhD, staying in Normandy in the nice place, you know, so maybe you should start again and try again. No, but I think you're right. Basically, you're right that Capital and Ideology is more a book of social sciences than probably, you know, at least a better book of social sciences than Capital in the 21st century. Okay. You mentioned, you know, you had a first question was about the importance of the stagflation in the 70s as a sort of missed opportunity for the left, which was very strong in the early 70s, and maybe they were about to do something, and somehow the stagflation shocks in the 70s. Well, your question was both what happened, you know, why was there this stagflation shocks, and the Keynesian policy did not work at the time, and then what was the more long-lasting consequences of this? You know, I think the reasons for the shocks now are quite well known, with the energy prices, with the wage pressure, especially after 1968 movement, and with the political mobilization of the 1970s that was putting enormous wage pressure at a time when the output growth was going to suffer from energy price shocks and inflation. You know, there was already some high inflation period in the 60s and 50s. So it's not as if Keynesian demand management was always able to keep, you know, inflation completely under control. So it could have been another inflationary shock. And I think it's always difficult to say, you know, the idea of missed opportunities in the 70s, I think, is partly right. You know, there's a very nice book that was published a few years ago called her name, she's a European Union specialist. Her name is Andri. Well, anyway, she has this book called The Road Not Taken, European Union discussion in the 70s. Well, basically, she's trying to make the case that in the mid-70s to the late 1970s, when, you know, at some point you had the Social Democrats in Germany, the Labour in Britain in 76, 78, and the French socialists almost won the election of 1978, that there was quite advanced discussion, for instance, about the new company directive in the European Commission, trying to extend to all European countries co-determination rules, German-style co-determination rules, which social democratic government in Germany was trying to reinforce at the time. So she's trying to make the case that it was actually quite close to a quite different European roads that could have been taken at the time. So, and I have a lot of sympathy for this kind of approach in general, because I think, yes, you have bifurcation and missed opportunities all the time, and different roads could have been taken. That being said, I think there were also deeper and sort of you mentioned, you said lack of imagination by the leadership of the left parties, but I think it goes beyond this. I think in a way, before the Soviet collapse, the Soviet dream had already collapsed, and it was not a dream anymore for not only in the Soviet Union but in the West, and in particular in the 70s, it's already it becomes clear in the mid 1970s that lots of social indicators in the Soviet Union are, you have this famous book published in French in 1976 showing the decline called La Chute Finale by Emmanuel Todd, where he shows the decline of life expectancy in the Soviet Union starting in the late 60s, with an increase in child mortality, which you don't expect to see in peacetime, and sort of really demonstrating a health system and a social system very much under stress, under pressure, with limited resources, lots of inefficiencies, but already before reading that book, the 1968 movement, in a way, is, as we all know, is a movement that is that is taking a lot of distance, to say the least, with the Soviet model or the communist model, which is clearly not at all the horizon already at the time. And at the same time, the 1968 movement is not really producing a blueprint for another democratic socialism or for another model of socialism. It's trying, but at a time when the people who want to dismantle progressive taxation and who want to dismantle the welfare state, or at least to freeze the welfare state, are quite explicit about their objective. I think the other side is not so explicit about what they want to do next. And if I think of the Socialist Party in France and the Left Alliance, they have a platform for 1981, but it's not very imaginative. They just continue the nationalization of 1945 to the banking sector, but very little emancipatory policies for workers' power, for workers' empowerment. And then after it doesn't work so well, and then they move completely to what will then become the Maastricht Treaty 10 years later, which is basically free capital flow and almost complete sacralization of free capital flows without any public regulation. And this has really given birth to a large extent to the sort of globalized systems that we know today. And, there's this very nice book by Abdelal called Capital Rules, where he shows that, in fact, the modern form of free capital flows was not so much invented in Washington at the IMF, but rather between the French socialists and the German Christian Democrats dealing over the European currency union, and the French socialists being so desperate to convince the Christian Social Democrats to accept a single currency that they are ready to go for a form of free capital flows, which goes beyond even what the IMF will be ready to recommend to countries all over the world, especially after the East Asia crisis of the late 1990s. And I think this is a testimony for the lack of and I'm saying that I don't want to be just anti the French Socialist Party, because it's too easy today. You can see it in the French political scene just to say, we will do much better. It's complicated to be in power, and I don't want to blame them too much. But at the same time, yes, there was a lack of imagination, of thinking, what will be the alternative economic system, what form of democratic socialism we want to promote for the future. So I think in the end, that was, if the left, starting sort of lost steam and was not really starting in the 70s, 80s, 90s, did not have the energy which in mid-20th century, together with the existence of the communist counter model, helped move the balance of power in a different direction. On your second question, much more, broader in a way on idealism versus materialism. Let me simply say, something not very original, which I think, I believe, of course, in the power of ideology, the power of ideas, and, for different, you can have for the same level of material development, whatever it means, it's clear that there's a range of different ideological regimes that can prevail, throughout the world, from even within Europe, between the Swedish ideology of 1900 of how you organize political power, the British, the French, Indian, for similar level of material development, ideological imagination, and then the kind of institutions that are going to be supported by ideologies. And also ideas have a lot of power. Now, ideas, in order to get power, need material resources. So they need, so intellectuals and books, are material resources, but they are quite weak material resources as compared to, collective organization, whether they are churches, political parties, trade unions, business association, and the like, and state apparatus, military administration, intelligence, whatever. So all these different collectives are producing ideas and are diffusing ideas and make ideas dominant at one point or the other. So it's really through various forms of capital endowments, and then this some ideas come to dominate or not. So many questions, it's difficult to answer them all. Is there an alternative to neoliberalism? Well, yes, I think I'm trying, in my own limited role, to try to contribute to formulate, different version of some form of democratic socialism, participatory socialism for the 21st century. And I think, we need to be ambitious, and we need to think explicitly about the kind of long-run economic system we want. And I think, after the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's been a long period of time during the 1990s, 2000, where we've, to a large extent, we have collectively stopped thinking about, what alternative way to organize property relations. How do you deal with, different forms of worker empowerment? How do you reduce shareholder power to a minority vote in large companies, and, maybe in small firms, you want things to organize things a bit differently. So how do you deal with the transition from sort of small production unit to large production unit in terms of the distribution of power you want in this? That's what I'm trying to think about. But this is this has to be a much broader, much more ambitious and collective process. But yes, I think, there are alternatives to neoliberalism, which everybody, after the 2008 financial crisis, I think everybody has understood that, without public money creation, without central banks, neoliberalism would have collapsed entirely just in the same way than after the 1929 crisis. And so everybody now, including in the public opinion, is aware of the fact that without money creation and central banks to bail out private capitalist system, the whole thing would have collapsed immediately. And I think this is changing the name of the game, because, well, now, we've had inflation to try to sort out some of this contradiction, but inflation is not very well accepted, and austerity is going to be very difficult, to accept for the public opinion, which have observed, this ability of public monetary authorities to bail out billionaires and private banks, etc. So I think we have entered a new, sort of uncharted territories where neoliberalism has been fragilized and a lot, and the utopia of a sort of autonomy of markets without state support and without state power to actually either support capitalism or support alternative economic system. I think, this illusion is sort of gone. Now, the Chinese alternative, in a way, is based on a more realistic view of how state apparatus, has to support economic development and has to structure capitalism. So, the West has this illusion of, we don't need the state, the entrepreneur and capital. And that's clearly wrong. We know it, the entire history of capitalist development was made through, colonial expansion with enormous role for state colonialism and military support to colonial expansion and trade exploitation and extortion of resources throughout the world. The Chinese state is sort of very explicit about the fact that you need a powerful state, to structure economic development. And, I think it's a very, powerful alternative to the Western order, in the sense that if in purely sort of economic terms, you're looking at the property structure of China, what's very striking is that the privatization process has come to an end, at least for, around right after the 2008 financial crisis, but it coincides more with Xi Jinping a few years later consolidating his power, and the Chinese Communist Party apparatus deciding to stabilize. So, right now, you have about 50% of company ownership, which is public. Most of real estate has been privatized, so housing is privatized at 90%. But overall, the share of the state and the Communist Party in total property is about 30%. 50% of companies, 10% of housing, and so because it's about half of the national capital stock, it's about 30% public, which makes the state looks. So it's not like the Soviet state, who tries to own 90% or everything. It's more like the sort of mixed property systems that we had to some extent in the West in the 1950-1980 period. So with a completely different political system and governance regime, based on the authority of the single party. But it gives to the state, a very powerful role to organize investment in different regions, to try to check that territorial disparities remain under control, and to invest in the rest of the world, given the size of the Chinese state and the Chinese economy. So it creates a state actor which has a capacity that we have never seen, basically, in history. So we are in completely new uncharted territory, to say the least. Now, it has some fragilities, which the main being that no country in Africa or anywhere in the world plans to create a communist party of Congo to emulate the communist Chinese regime. And so this is not going to happen as far as I can see. So that's a big limitation in the exportation of the political system of China, of course. But apart from that, it's a very serious competitor. So, and which, also brings me to your last point about tax evasion. I think from the point of view of the West, in order to respond to the Chinese challenge and to the Chinese narrative about colonialism and about the fact that China itself developed without colonialism, which is true and not true at the same time. But anyway, at least they can pretend, they can say that they were colonized and they suffered from colonialism. In order to respond to this narrative, the West, so far has been extremely weak. So if you think of what was done for the taxation of multinationals, the 15% tax rate on multinational, first, this is ridiculously small. There are lots of exceptions. You can get away it. And, we are still in a situation where small and medium-sized companies in Serbia or in France are actually paying more tax than multinationals who can put their profits in a tax haven and pay only 15% or less. But in addition, this was entirely a north-north game. So there was basically no tax revenue in the OECD agreement is going to the south. And, I think the egoism of the West, after the COVID vaccine story and with this global tax measures, which basically give €0 to the south, the West then should not be surprised that then when you ask everybody to take sanctions against Russia and stop doing trade with Russia, the rest of the world is telling you, look, you still have all the Russian money in Courchevel and London and Paris when it suits you, when it's good for your banking system, but then you are asking us to stop making trade with Russia. This makes no sense. So the only, as long as the West does not accept the idea of transforming the economic system, not only the tax system, but also, voting rights in the IMF, World Bank, so as to basically give more to the, let the South take a bigger space. I agree with you that the capacity of China to gain influence in the South, will just grow and grow. Last question, you said, instead of sanctioning Poland and Hungary, after all, this is their business. Instead, in addition to, but you mentioned an interesting idea, which you said, after all, Poland and Hungary are only hurting themselves. You said, yeah. So I'm not sure I will put it this way, but I fully agree with you that the fact that we tolerate the extractive strategy of Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland, but also the problem is that everybody is playing an extractive strategy when they like it. So even, France last year, the Macron government created a new tax regime. I mean, it's completely anecdotal, but it's still interesting in order to attract, the International Football Association, FIFA, which is based in Switzerland. So they passed a law in the French parliament saying, okay, you will pay 0 income tax for the next 10 years, 0 property tax for the next 10 years, and bring the headquarters of FIFA to Paris, basically, which is a completely, half corrupt institution with people gaining €1 million for doing, selling TV rights all over the world. And the only policy of the French government, is to say, okay, let's do another, tax race to the bottom in order to attract a few people. So the problem is that every country is playing, this kind of extractive strategy where in effect you're just playing a zero-sum game and in fact a negative-sum game because you're taking resources out of the normal people. I have been a co-author of this manifesto for the democratization of Europe, where we push the idea of a smaller groups of countries moving to a common tax policy and gradually convincing more countries that this. But to be honest, I think in order to have I still think that this will happen one day. But in order to have this to happen, I think we have to go through a sort of a period based on unilateral action. So you need countries, so say a French government or government in another country, to basically say unilaterally so if you have a company that is based in the Netherlands or based in Ireland and they pay, say, 0 corporate tax and they want to export goods and services to France, where firms based in France pay 25% or 30% corporate tax, well, there's a missing tax, there's a tax that was not paid. And if you want to export your goods and services to me, that's fine, but you will have to pay, in effect, as tariffs, this 25-30% tax. Now, the difference with the standard tariff protectionist policy is that if you increase your tax rate on profits to 25 or 30%, the tariff will disappear. So it's more it's an incentive to make you move. But now, some people will say this is completely contrary to European treaties, and to some extent it is. And given that the European Court of Justice is filled with pretty reactionary judges, many of them coming from Eastern Europe, by the way, I think too many judges from Eastern Europe is a problem in many cases in the European justice. Well, not because they are Eastern European, but because they are quite reactionary on economic issues. I mean, the Western ones are not very good either. But anyway, there's the country, you know, might be condemned by the European Union, but then, you know, it becomes a political fight. And I think, you know, if there is sufficient political legitimacy in a French election or German election or Italian or Spanish elections to push for this, at some point, you know, this will be the only way to force for change. So this will not happen you know, in a nice meeting, European Council like this. You know, this will, people, you know, will shout and cry, and you know, there will be some crises. It cannot, unfortunately, happen quietly.
Thank you very much. We need to move on to last two panelists tonight. So Marian and Mikhail, floor is yours. Just check if the mic is on.
Is it? Yes, it is. Okay. Thanks. Well, I will just try to say a few things about ideology, a few questions and comments that I have, and maybe which are related to what Ivica was asking about the relationship between ideas and matter and so on. So I would absolutely agree with the main premise of the book, the one that ideas matter. That is, that ideas are not epiphenomena of the structure of material reproduction in a given societal formation, and that ideas are important key or even key causal factors in political action and historical social change. But I would like to ask what exactly you mean by ideas, or rather, what are all the elements that this term encompasses? Ideas are clearly, in your perspective, the various kinds of answers that we can give to the question, how should society be ordered? And as you stress, there cannot be any deterministic relation between someone's position in the social structure and the answer one gives to this question. So ideas clearly mean normative ideas that we hold, specific conceptions of justice, fairness, autonomy, political authority, etc. But closely related to normative ideas, and actually, I would say subtending these ideas, grounding them, are what might be called ontological ideas, that is, specific explanatory conceptions of social reality that people hold. And these are answers to questions such as, what is social reality ultimately made of? Is it made of individual consciousnesses? Is it made of self-realizing spirit? Is it made of power relations, etc.? Now, we can pose the general question of whether normative ideas have to be grounded in social ontological ideas or not for them to be politically effective. And there is a huge debate in political theory about whether there can be plausible post-metaphysical normative conceptions that are non-foundational, which means conceptions of the good society that do not rest on ontological foundations. But the question of political efficacy is a whole different matter, and it brings us to empirical reality and what we can observe in history. And you argue that in the so-called trifunctional society, one of the key functions or one of the key human needs is that of providing meaning. And it is delegated to the clerical class in the trifunctional pre-modern society. And subsequently, the evolution of what you call proprietarian ideology involves as a key component the development of the classical liberal social ontology, which is characterized by an atomistic, we could say, social contract vision of social reality, and a corresponding theory of the human subject as the Homo economicus. And there are other components, let's say the key modern conceptual binaries between society and nature, between consciousness and matter, between genders, let's say between public and private, and so forth. So I would say it's not so easy to sacralize property as a normative attitude of the classical proprietarianism without these corresponding social ontological foundations, which ground the legitimacy of such sacralization. If you have an atomistic conception of social reality, then you can sacralize property as an inalienable right, an absolute right. Now, the Marxist-Leninist challenge to proprietarianism rested on an alternative, we could say, teleological and eschatological view of both social and natural reality, social in Marx and natural in Hegel. The social democratic ideology, in turn, can essentially be seen as only a normative modification of the proprietarian ideology, while what you call neo-proprietarian ideology, and we could also call it neoliberal, of course, I would argue is also a significant ontological modification of classical proprietarianism. And here one is reminded of Hayek, primarily in his order liberalism, with his key conception of the market, the globalized market society as a kind of super consciousness or super mind, something that exists above individual subjectivities and transcends their capacity of comprehension, but can be considered some kind of an emergent property or some kind of super subjective intelligent entity. Now, if we look at things this way, if we look at both the normative and ontological dimensions of different ideologies, we might also argue that the social democracy of the period of 1950 to 1980 ultimately failed because it rested merely on a normative modification of proprietarianism, and it was therefore self-contradictory. It pitted a kind of relational, anti-individualistic normative outlook against its own still atomistic ontological foundation that made it clearly quite unstable. And one could argue, therefore, that the social democratic left abandoned the key task of providing meaning to people, given its purely normative modification of proprietarian ideology. And then we could use this to explain its lack of imagination also in normative terms. And now, when you analyze the great electoral cleavage between the left parties and the working class that took place since the 1970s, the transformation of the workers' left into the Brahmin left, and it coincides with the transformation of social democracy into neo-proprietarianism, you argue in favor of the social hypothesis for explaining this cleavage rather than the nativist one. The social hypothesis is essentially that the working class felt increasingly abandoned by the left parties in the West, and for good reasons if we look at the policies of those parties. And this abandonment, you stress, needs to be understood in terms of ideas and not simply of interests, as it sometimes is explained, that simply the workers felt that these parties were not acting in their immediate interests. No, they felt they were abandoned in a deeper sense, in a conceptual sense. Now, the turn to what you call egalitarian nativism, exemplified by Le Pen, by Trump, and which is a trap, has more to do, in the social hypothesis that you endorse, has more to do with the egalitarianism part than with the nativism part. That's the hypothesis, and therefore it's basically a normative issue for the working class. However, then there's a problem. If it's a purely normative issue, then it's hard to understand why voters would remain attached to this kind of nativism even after nativists come to power and don't do anything, economically speaking, for the working class. That is, once they turn out not to be egalitarian, but rather market nativists. And we are here reminded of Trump in 2020 getting more votes than he did in 2016. So it seems to me we also have to consider the ontological dimension here. Ever since neo-proprietarian or the liberal ideology entered the crisis due to the very steep rise in inequalities after 2000 and the 2008 financial meltdown, which really kind of challenged the validity of both the normative and ontological aspects of neo-proprietarianism, I would argue nativism has tried to offer a comprehensive, both normative and ontological conception of reality. In addition to its positioning, a normative positioning on the issues of borders and property, nativism has engaged in a strong renaturalization of the key binaries of classical proprietarianism that I just briefly mentioned before, which had become somewhat blurred in neo-proprietarianism because neo-proprietarianism is constructivist in its ontological dimension rather than realist or naturalist like classical proprietarianism. It can tolerate this kind of blurring of these binaries. And this created a sense of, I would say, existential uneasiness and meaninglessness. Nativism reinforces the society-nature binary. This is integral to the climate change denialism. It reinforces the gender binary, and it reinforces very much the public-private binary on an ontological level. And all this raises the final question whether a new left that goes beyond the social democratic ideology and that you try to conceptualize it at the end of the book also needs, in addition to its normative innovations, an innovative ontological foothold, one that would challenge both the neo-proprietarian ontological core, the concept of the market as an emergent property, as an intelligent entity, and the nativist one of dichotomizing commonsensical view of reality. Thanks.
Marnia. And Mikhail,
yes.
Just
I'm well aware that last in practice often means the least, so I will try to be really short. Just a couple of general comments, or rather the framework, how I see this book, which is really huge in both senses. It moves in the economic parts on which I will a little bit focus. It moves from focus on top 1% to general distribution issues. So that's first, broadening of scope. Then also it moves to global instead of only Western topics. So that's another, I think, really important contribution, and also moves through time, addressing and historical and political issues historically and also globally in a very ambitious manner. Now I will focus mostly on the issue of inequality in post-communist countries, and with a view, of course, always on Serbia. And I think that this chapter is really, really interesting, and it also shows the power of actually relying on empirical findings. For example, we in Serbia tend to think of foreign direct investment as something which is negative and which increases inequality. Not so in, for example, Visegrad countries or in Central European countries. Actually, there are two factors. The first one is that the foreign investors take the profit with them. So the profit that would otherwise accrue to the local capitalist goes abroad, and so the top 1% gets in the country gets less. But then also the wages tend to be higher because of the competition of international and local capitalists. So such insights are all over this interesting chapter. But I would also rather focus on the use of distributional income accounts, DINA framework, which is something really sort of, to my mind, revolutionary. It, of course, has its roots like 60 years ago or so, but it has been used by Thomas Piketty in the past 15 years or so. And then actually there is entire now movement or school doing this on a global scale. And these distributional income accounts, I think, are extremely sort of good to capture all the complexity of inequality, because we are used to looking at partial inequality analysis. We are used to looking at the pre-tax and the post-tax inequality, exemplified by Gini coefficients. And then, okay, you have the market inequality, which is always high, like 50 Gini points or so. And then comes the government and taxes firms and gives the money to people, pensioners, or whoever, and the inequality goes down to 30 points. So there is a sort of, okay, there is a state which is very efficient in innovative. Not so in this framework. This framework gives a sort of rather small changes because it, on the one hand, takes care whom from whom the taxes are taken, and very often they're taken mostly from poor people, if indirect taxation is dominant, and then also looks at who benefits from, and not only who benefits directly, but also who benefits indirectly from collective consumption, collective spending, which is also something really innovative. What is the problem with this framework? Of course, this framework is extremely complex, and you know, their criticism about that, that it might mean that those who apply such analysis might have their own biases, and that might, because it requires both micro, so surveys on the one hand, but then on the other hand, it requires macro statistics to match them both. So the problem is that it could be seen as something where actually those who do it basically as scientists, researchers, not as the national statistical offices, that they do it following their own biases. So the first question would be, how do you see the future of distributional income accounts? Should they become a sort of a part of a global, of national and then global statistics? Whether at some point, like in 10 or 20 years, we would have statistics on, I don't know, perhaps that would be the bottom 50% share in national income, published together with the GMP and national GDP and national income data and so on, by, you know, international organizations, and how to overcome these biases. And then maybe last question, yes, that's how do you see the practical consequences of basically using this in, for example, among the policymakers, the DINA framework? I somehow thought now, seeing my old colleague and the former Minister of Finance of Serbia, who was the Minister of Finance in a sort of really formative days, like 20 years ago, he in a way did not have such instrument at his hands. And yes, and at that time, perhaps if he would have that DINA framework for assessing inequality, and if he had, for example, if he been able to do macro simulations to see how would his reforms, you know, impact on the share of the bottom 50%, for example, he might have had some things done differently. Because, for example, the analysis of your colleagues, which I often quote, and I will end with that, Chancel and Blanchet, which actually took Serbia as a full member of the group of European countries, has shown that the share of bottom 50% declined from 20% of national income to 15% between the years 2000 and 2012. And maybe our entire political scene would now look differently if that DINA instrument were available.
Thank you very much, both. You have time. I don't want to limit you, so
well, no, I think we all it's very late for everybody. So you know, thanks a lot to both of you. Thanks a lot to everybody. You know, I would love that we discuss more about, you know, the you know, what kind of new ontological foundation for the left to complement, you know, the normative perspective. And to be honest, I'm not completely sure I understand fully the how you draw the frontier between the two dimensions, the distinction between the two. As you said, they you know, they overlap, and the you know, the ontological foundation, you know, have consequences for the normative perspective. I don't think we're going to be able to solve this problem tonight, right now. But I'd be very, very thanks a lot for your I think the way you summarize the whole argument from tri-functional society to neo-proprietarian society was very interesting to me, and I really am looking forward that we continue the discussion. But I don't think we're going to solve this right now before 8. Regarding the question on distributional national accounts, your question is, is this something that researchers, academics should keep doing, or is this going to be transferred to government, National Statistical Institute, international organization? Ideally that would be great. I think we have been working with the United Nations team. There are United Nations guidelines on how to produce national accounts, and in principle there will be guidelines for distributional national accounts in the next round. I don't remember, in 5 years or whatever, the next round of guidelines. Now, does this mean that this will be left to National Statistical Institute and government? I'm not so sure, because I think for a long time, it is true. Look, it is true that historically, the first national accounts that were developed after the Great Depression were first produced by academics, Simon Kuznets, other people, and then were sort of transferred to National Statistical Institute, who have been taken the task of computing GDP after World War II. So the same, in principle, could happen for distributional national accounts. Now, the reason why I think it's going to be more difficult and it's going to take a lot more time is that it's also a lot more political and controversial. Telling a government, for instance, if you are in power, if there is, your National Statistical Institute, which says, okay, last year you pretend that you have 2% economic growth, but in fact the top 1% got 90% of the economic growth and the bottom 50% got 0, is like killing you completely. So, having sufficient trust in the method and the process and the independence of the Statistical Institute, so that this will happen quietly and smoothly, and you will let it happen, and people will believe the conclusion. That's complicated. Look, I think this is possible to build institution like this, but I think for a long time to come, this task will belong to crazy academics like me, or independent academics like this, who do not. If I say something, if we publish something at the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics, we are not the official French Statistical Institute, we are not Eurostat, we are not the World Bank. So we are able to say things which official Statistical Institute, will have a hard time saying for a long time. I mean, it's already complicated for GDP figures. I remember when Nicolas Sarkozy was finance minister, before becoming president in France, he could not accept the fact that French Statistical Institute would refuse to communicate to him the GDP statistic before their official public release. And, I remember a completely crazy meeting where the director of INSEE was telling Sarkozy, but look, these are the guidelines set by United Nations, Eurostat. I cannot give you the numbers before their public release. And Sarkozy was like, was shouting at him, you're a piece of shit. You don't know what the people want. I know what they want. It was, but in the end, I think he fired the INSEE director, in fact, which shows that, there are limits to the supposed independence of this, although the French Statistical Institute is to be particularly independent, but at the end of the day, he's independent, except that he's nominated by the Council of Ministers on Wednesday. So, so the bottom line is that, we need also researchers and social scientists, and we need, independent research centers which can provide social indicators which can be used not only by government, but also by civil society, political actors, trade unions, to try to change the balance of power with the government. So I think we will keep doing that for a long time. Although personally, I will be very happy to get rid of this and develop new tools, in particular to do more material accounting, because I think, the big issue with climate change and the environmental catastrophe to come is to move away from money accounts. The big problem of money account, I think looking at the distribution of money income and money wealth, is important. It's a useful metric, but at the end of the day, you're not going to compensate 3 additional degrees by more billions of dollars, So you need to move to more material accounting for the climate, but for both biodiversity, for land use, and that's really the direction. Jayati made a reference to this, to work by Lucas Chancel. That's really the direction in which we are moving at the World Inequality Lab. So I'd be very happy to get rid of the other part and to focus on the new part, but I don't think that's going to be possible. Anyway, thanks a lot to everybody, and sorry for that it took more time than planned, and yes,
it took exactly
the time. Okay. And yes, thanks a lot. This has been really very, informative for me, and this will help me to think about the next books. I had lots of suggestions, and I will try to follow them the best I can. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for saying that. I actually wanted to close with the hope that everything what was said here gave you some inspiration for the further work, and knowing that you don't really frequently travel out to France, I have to emphasize once more that we are really honored that you came to Belgrade, and we hope that at least some of your thinking will shape also the thinking and action which we are going to have here at the Institute. I also want to thank the panelists also, if they are still with us online, and the audience which was here with us. And for the end, I also want to say, because he's here, thanks to Bože Djelić for joining us. Many people here don't know, but maybe those who are in Institute for more than 10 years, for 13 years, they would know that without him and his small action 13 years ago, this Institute wouldn't look like it looks like today. So thank you very much for supporting us back then. And finally, thank you for being with us when we had a lot of troubles. And we really hope that all this support which we gathered, and with you heading it in a way, will help us also to go through the very, I would say, quite difficult times that we also have in front of us. So thank you once more.